The winter of 1876 came early to Wood River, Nebraska, and Violet Sinclair knew she was running out of time. The frost had settled into the ground like iron, making every morning a battle just to fetch water from the well behind the modest house her late husband had built 3 years before. Violet stood on the porch, 24 years old and already a widow, watching the gray clouds gather over the flat prairie horizon. Her breath hung in the cold air as she surveyed the collection of furniture, tools, and household goods she had arranged in the yard that morning. Everything had to go. She could not afford to keep the house through another month, let alone another winter, and the bank had made that abundantly clear. Her husband Thomas had died 6 months ago when his horse spooked during a summer storm, throwing him against a boulder that cracked his skull. The doctor said he never felt any pain, but Violet felt enough for both of them. The grief had been suffocating at first, but now it had settled into a dull, constant ache that she carried with her through every waking moment. What made it worse was the crushing weight of debt Thomas had accumulated trying to expand their small ranch. He had been optimistic, always seeing the potential in everything, but potential did not pay bills. She had no family to turn to. Her parents had died of fever when she was 16, and Thomas had been an only child raised by an uncle who passed before they married. The other women in town were kind enough, bringing casseroles and offering prayers, but none could offer what she truly needed, a way to keep her home and her dignity. So here she stood, selling everything she owned. The oak dining table Thomas had commissioned from a carpenter in Omaha sat in the frozen grass, its polished surface already dulling in the winter air. Beside it were 4 matching chairs, a bookshelf filled with the few books they had collected, kitchen implements, quilts her mother had made, a grandfather clock that no longer worked, and Thomas's tools, each one meticulously maintained until the day he died. Even her wedding dress, carefully preserved in a trunk, sat among the items for sale. What use did a widow have for a wedding dress? The first potential buyers arrived around mid-morning. Mrs. Patterson from the general store looked through the quilts with her daughter, clucking her tongue sympathetically while offering prices so low Violet wanted to weep. But she nodded, accepted the coins, and watched as they carried away her mother's handiwork. A farmer she recognized from church bought some of the tools, counting out his money slowly, as if each coin caused him physical pain to part with. By noon, she had sold perhaps a third of everything, and the money would barely cover 2 months of what she owed. The wind picked up, bitter and sharp, cutting through her wool coat as if it were made of paper. Violet pulled her shawl tighter and stamped her feet to keep the blood flowing. Her fingers were numb despite her gloves, and she wondered if she should have waited for a warmer day. But there were no warm days coming, and there was no more time. She was examining the remaining items, trying to calculate if she could somehow make the numbers work, when she heard the sound of hoofbeats approaching. Violet looked up to see a lone rider coming down the road, sitting tall in the saddle despite the cold. As he drew closer, she could make out more details. A dark brown horse with white socks on its front legs, a rider wearing a black coat and a wide-brimmed hat pulled low against the wind, and something in the way he carried himself that suggested capability and confidence. The cowboy slowed his horse as he approached her property, his eyes scanning the items spread across the yard. He dismounted with an easy grace, looping his reins around the fence post before walking toward her. Violet straightened her spine, trying to look more composed than she felt. "Afternoon, madam," he said, tipping his hat to reveal dark hair and eyes that were an unusual shade of gray-blue, like storm clouds over the prairie. He looked to be in his late 20s, with a strong jaw shadowed by a few days of stubble and a face that was handsome in a weathered, practical way. "Saw you were selling some items." "Yes, sir," Violet replied, forcing herself to meet his gaze. She had learned that showing weakness in business dealings only made things worse. "Everything you see here is available. I can give you fair prices." He nodded slowly, his eyes moving across the collection. "Mind if I take a look around? Please do." She watched as he walked among her possessions, his gloved hands occasionally reaching out to touch something to test the weight or quality. He examined Thomas's tools with particular interest, picking up a hammer, checking its balance, setting it down gently. He ran his hand along the surface of the dining table, bent to look at the construction of the chairs, and even opened one of the books, reading a few lines before closing it carefully. "You are selling everything?" he asked, his voice carrying a note of something she could not quite identify. Curiosity, perhaps, or concern. "Yes," Violet said, lifting her chin slightly. "I have no use for these things anymore. That is a lot to part with all at once. Sometimes circumstances require difficult choices." He turned to look at her directly, and she found herself unable to look away from those gray-blue eyes. There was an intelligence in them and something else, a kind of understanding that made her throat tighten unexpectedly. "I am sorry for your loss," he said quietly. "I heard about Thomas Sinclair's passing. He was a good man." Violet blinked, surprised. "You knew my husband, met him a few times. We did some business together last year when I was passing through. He bought some horses from the ranch I work for, up north near the border. He spoke highly of you." The unexpected kindness in his words made her eyes burn with unshed tears, and she looked away quickly, staring hard at the horizon until she regained control. "Thank you. That is kind of you to say." The cowboy was quiet for a moment, then he said, "How much for all of it?" Violet's head snapped back toward him. "All of what?" "Everything here. The furniture, the tools, the books, all of it. How much would you need to sell it all at once?" Her heart began to beat faster. She did quick calculations in her head, adding up what she had hoped to get for each item, knowing she would have to accept less but afraid to lowball and lose this unexpected opportunity. $300, she said, then immediately wondered if she had aimed too high. The cowboy did not even blink. $300 for everything here and you would be clear of debt. The house would be yours free and clear. Violet stammered, confused by the specific question. "No, I would still owe on the house. But it would give me time, maybe enough to figure something else out." "How much do you owe total?" "I do not think that is any of your business, sir," she said, her voice sharper than she intended. Pride was about all she had left, and she was not about to bear all her financial failures to a stranger, even one with kind eyes. "Forgive me," he said, holding up his hands. "You are right. That was overstepping." He looked around again, then back at her. "I will buy everything here, all of it." "For $500. Violet's breath caught. "500. But I said 3. I know what you said. But these are quality items, and I know they are worth more than 300, and I suspect you do too. 500 is fair." She stared at him, trying to understand what was happening. $500 was more than she had dared to hope for. It would pay off the house completely, with enough left over to buy supplies to get through the winter. It would give her a chance to start over, to figure out what came next without the constant terror of losing everything. "Why?" she asked. "Why would you do that?" The cowboy, she realized she still did not know his name, met her eyes steadily. "Because you need it, and I can afford it, and sometimes that is reason enough." Before she could respond, he reached into his coat and pulled out a leather wallet. Violet watched in stunned silence as he counted out bills, the wind ruffling the edges of the paper money. $500. It seemed impossible. He held the money out to her, and she took it with shaking hands, staring down at more money than she had seen in one place in years. "Now," he said, his voice taking on a different tone, something gentler, "I need you to listen to me carefully, Mrs. Sinclair. I am buying all of these things, that is true. I have paid for them, and they are mine." Violet nodded, still dazed, clutching the money. "But I have no use for furniture or quilts or dishes," he continued. "I work on a ranch, and I live in a bunkhouse with 6 other men. I have no need for a dining table or a grandfather clock. So here is what is going to happen." He paused, and when he spoke again, his voice was firm but incredibly kind. "Keep it." "What?" The word came out as barely a whisper. "Keep it, all of it. It is yours. I bought it, and now I am telling you to keep it." "I do not understand," Violet said, her mind reeling. "You are giving me $500 and telling me to keep everything? That makes no sense." "It makes perfect sense to me," he replied. "You need these things. You need this fresh start. Consider it a loan if that makes you feel better about accepting it. When you are back on your feet, if you want to pay me back, you can. But there is no timeline and no interest." Tears were flowing freely down her cheeks now, and she did not bother to wipe them away. "I do not even know your name." "Dalton Xavier," he said, and for the first time he smiled, a small but genuine expression that transformed his face. "I work for the Triple Creek Ranch, about 2 days' ride north of here." "Mr. Xavier, I cannot possibly accept this. It is too much. You do not even know me. I know you are a widow trying to survive a hard winter. I know you have been dealt an unfair hand and you are doing your best to play it with dignity. That is enough for me to know." He picked up his reins, preparing to mount his horse. "Keep the money, Mrs. Sinclair. Pay off your debts. Keep your home, and do not let pride get in the way of accepting help when it is freely given." "Wait," Violet called out as he swung into the saddle. "Will I see you again?" Dalton looked down at her from atop his horse, something flickering in those gray-blue eyes. "Would you like to?" The question hung in the cold air between them. Violet knew she should say something proper, something demure and appropriate for a woman in mourning. But standing there in her frozen yard, clutching a lifeline she never expected, she found she did not want to lie. "Yes," she said simply. "I would." His smile widened slightly. "Then I will make sure to pass through Wood River again soon. Take care of yourself, Mrs. Sinclair." He turned his horse and rode away, and Violet stood watching until he disappeared over the rise. Then she looked down at the money in her hands, at the furniture and belongings still scattered across her yard, and she began to laugh. It started as a small sound, almost a sob, but it grew into genuine laughter, the first real joy she had felt in 6 long months. The next morning, Violet walked into the Wood River Bank and Trust with her head held high. Mr. Carmichael, the bank manager, looked surprised to see her. He was a portly man in his 50s with thinning hair and a perpetual expression of mild disapproval that deepened whenever he saw her. "Mrs. Sinclair," he said, his tone suggesting he had been expecting her to fail. "What can I do for you today?" "I am here to pay off my loan," Violet said, placing the money on his desk. "In full." His eyebrows shot up and he leaned forward to examine the bills. "This is most unexpected. May I ask where you came by such a sum?" "I sold some items," Violet said, which was not exactly a lie. "Do you need to count it, or can we settle this matter now?" Mr. Carmichael counted the money twice, his frown deepening as if personally offended that she had managed to escape his clutches. He filled out the necessary paperwork, his pen scratching across the paper with more force than strictly necessary, and finally stamped the document that declared her debt paid in full. "You understand that this only covers the loan on the house," he said. "Should you need credit in the future, I will not," Violet interrupted, taking the papers and folding them carefully. "Good day, Mr. Carmichael." She left the bank feeling lighter than she had in months, possibly years. The house was hers. No one could take it from her now. She still needed to figure out how to support herself going forward, but the immediate crisis had passed. And that was enough for today. Over the next week, Violet began to put her life back in order. She moved all the furniture back into the house, swept and cleaned until everything gleamed, and took stock of what she had. The money left over from paying the bank would see her through the winter if she was careful, but she needed a plan for spring. She could not simply sell off her possessions again. She thought often of Dalton Xavier. Who was this man who had ridden into her life at her lowest moment and changed everything? She found herself watching the road, half hoping to see him riding back, but days passed with no sign of him. She told herself it was foolish to think of him so much. He had done her a kindness, nothing more. The fact that he had a kind smile and eyes that seemed to see right through to her soul was irrelevant. Still, she wondered. The answer to her financial concerns came from an unexpected source. Mrs. Patterson from the general store stopped by one afternoon with a proposition. Her daughter was getting married in the spring, and she wanted a special wedding dress. She had seen the needlework on the quilts Violet had tried to sell and wondered if she might be interested in taking commissions for sewing. "I can sew," Violet said carefully, "but I have never made a wedding dress before." "But you made your own, did you not?" Mrs. Patterson asked. "I saw it among your items for sale. It was beautiful work." Violet thought of the dress, carefully stored away again in its trunk upstairs. She had made it herself, spending months on the delicate embroidery and careful stitching. "Yes, I made it." "Then you can make one for my Sarah. I will pay you well, and if it turns out as lovely as I expect, I will recommend you to others. Half the women in this town need alterations or new dresses, and the nearest seamstress is 2 towns over. You could make a decent living at it." It was not what Thomas had envisioned for their future, but Thomas was gone and Violet was still here. She needed to survive, and if that meant becoming a seamstress, then that was what she would do. "All right," Violet agreed. "I will make your daughter's wedding dress." Word spread quickly in a small town like Wood River. Within 2 weeks, Violet had 3 more commissions: a christening gown, alterations on a suit, and a dress for the schoolteacher's upcoming birthday party. She set up her sewing area in the room that was supposed to have been a nursery, trying not to think about the children she and Thomas had planned to have. The treadle sewing machine had been her mother's, and working it felt like having a piece of her past with her, helping her build toward a future. Christmas came and went quietly. Violet attended church services and accepted an invitation to Christmas dinner with the Pattersons, enduring their well-meaning attempts to cheer her up. She appreciated their kindness, but she was relieved when she could return home to her quiet house, where she did not have to pretend to be more recovered from her grief than she truly was. January brought heavy snows that blanketed the prairie in white. Violet worked on her sewing projects by lamplight, her fingers growing ever more skilled with each stitch. She found there was something meditative about the work, the repetitive motion of needle through fabric, creating something beautiful and useful. It would never make her rich, but it would keep her fed and housed, and that was more than she had dared hope for 3 months ago. She still thought about Dalton Xavier more often than she should. Sometimes, late at night when the wind howled around the house, she wondered if she had imagined him entirely. A kind stranger who appeared at exactly the right moment with exactly what she needed seemed too good to be true. But then she would look at the papers declaring her house paid in full, and she knew he had been real. February arrived with slightly warmer temperatures, and the snow began to melt, turning the streets of Wood River into rivers of mud. Violet was measuring fabric for a new project when she heard a knock at her door. She set down her shears and went to answer it, expecting Mrs. Patterson or perhaps another potential customer. Instead, Dalton Xavier stood on her porch, hat in hand, looking exactly as she remembered him. "Hello, Mrs. Sinclair," he said, and that small smile played at the corners of his mouth. "I hope I am not intruding." Violet's heart was suddenly beating too fast, and she could feel heat rising in her cheeks. "Mr. Xavier, this is a surprise." "I told you I would pass through again," he said. "I am a man of my word." "Please come in," she said, stepping back to let him enter. "You must be half frozen. Let me make some coffee." "That would be appreciated." She led him into the kitchen, acutely aware of his presence in her home, the way he seemed to fill the space without overwhelming it. He was taller than she remembered, or perhaps the low ceiling made him seem so. He removed his coat, hanging it on the hook by the door, and sat at the kitchen table when she gestured to a chair. Violet busied herself with the coffee, grateful for something to do with her hands. "How long are you in town?" "Just passing through on my way back to the ranch." "We have been driving cattle to market in Omaha. It is good timing, as it turns out. I have been wondering how you were managing." "Thanks to your generosity, I am managing quite well," Violet said, setting the coffee pot on the stove. She turned to face him, wanting to be direct. "I still do not understand why you did what you did, Mr. Xavier, but I want you to know it changed everything for me. You saved my home. You gave me a chance to start over. I will never be able to thank you enough." "You do not need to thank me," Dalton said. "I am just glad I could help. And please call me Dalton. Mr. Xavier makes me feel like my father." "Then you must call me Violet," she replied, and saying her given name felt strangely intimate, but also right. They talked while the coffee brewed, and Violet found conversation with him came easily. He told her about the ranch where he worked, about the cattle drives, and the hard work of keeping the animals alive through harsh winters. He spoke about growing up in Kansas, about losing his own parents to cholera when he was 17, and making his way west to start over. There was a kinship in their shared experience of loss, an understanding that did not need to be spoken aloud. She told him about her sewing business, about the commissions that kept her busy, and the satisfaction of creating something with her own hands. She even told him about the nursery that was now her workroom, and the dreams she and Thomas had shared that would never come to pass. It was easier to speak of these things with Dalton than it had been with anyone else, perhaps because he listened without offering platitudes or trying to minimize her grief. "You have built something here," Dalton said when she finished. "Something that is yours. That takes courage." "I did not have much choice," Violet said, pouring the coffee and bringing 2 cups to the table. "There is always a choice. You could have given up. You could have left town, gone to work in a factory somewhere, lost yourself in bitterness. But you did not. You stayed and you fought, and you made a life. That is worth something." Violet cradled her coffee cup in her hands, letting the warmth seep into her fingers. "You seem to have a high opinion of me based on very little information." "I am a good judge of character," Dalton replied. "It is a necessary skill in my line of work. You have to know who you can trust when you are out on the trail with nothing but your horse and your instincts. And you trust me." "I do." He took a sip of his coffee, his eyes meeting hers over the rim of the cup. "The question is, do you trust me?" It was a fair question, and Violet considered it carefully. She knew almost nothing about this man beyond the fact that he had helped her when she desperately needed it. That was not much to base trust on, logically speaking. But logic had never been particularly good at explaining the feelings that mattered most. "Yes," she said finally. "I do trust you. I am not entirely sure why, but I do." "Good," Dalton said, and his smile grew a bit wider. because I was hoping you might allow me to call on you properly. If you are amenable to that. Violet's breath caught. Call on me? You mean court me? That was my intention, yes. If it is too soon, I understand. Your husband has not been gone a year yet, and I do not want to be disrespectful to his memory or to you. It has been 8 months, Violet said quietly. Sometimes it feels like 8 years, and sometimes it feels like yesterday. She looked down at her coffee, gathering her thoughts. I cared for Thomas very much. We had a good marriage, and I miss him. But he is gone, and I am still here, and I do not think he would want me to spend the rest of my life alone out of some misplaced sense of loyalty to the past. That is a very pragmatic way of looking at it. The prairie teaches you to be pragmatic. You cannot afford sentimentality when survival is at stake. Violet looked up at him again. But I will confess that my reasons for wanting you to call on me are not entirely pragmatic. No. Dalton leaned forward slightly, his interest clearly piqued. No, Violet confirmed, feeling bold. I like you, Dalton Xavier. I liked you from the moment you offered to help me without expecting anything in return, and I would very much like to see you again, as often as your work allows. Then it is settled, Dalton said, looking pleased. I will be back in Wood River in 2 weeks. May I take you to dinner at the hotel restaurant? I would like that very much. They finished their coffee talking about lighter things, and when Dalton stood to leave, Violet walked him to the door. He paused on the threshold, looking down at her with an expression that made her stomach flutter. I am glad I stopped by, he said. I have been thinking about you quite a bit these past months. I have been thinking about you too, Violet admitted. He reached out and gently tucked a strand of hair behind her ear, his fingers barely grazing her cheek. It was a simple gesture, but it sent warmth flooding through her. Until 2 weeks then. Until then. She watched him ride away, just as she had before, but this time was different. This time she knew he was coming back. True to his word, Dalton returned 2 weeks later on a Saturday evening. Violet had prepared carefully, wearing her best dress, a deep blue wool that brought out the color of her eyes, and pinning her dark hair up in a simple but elegant style. When she opened the door and saw his face light up at the sight of her, she knew the effort had been worthwhile. You look beautiful, he said, offering his arm. Thank you. You look quite handsome yourself. He had clearly made an effort as well, wearing a clean shirt and vest under his coat, his hair neatly combed, his jaw freshly shaven. They walked together to the hotel, and Violet was aware of the curious looks from townspeople they passed. She knew there would be gossip, there always was in a small town, but she found she did not care. Let them talk. She was done living her life according to other people's expectations. The hotel restaurant was modest but clean, with checkered tablecloths and candles on each table. The owner, Mr. Henderson, showed them to a table by the window and took their orders personally. Violet ordered the roasted chicken, and Dalton asked for the beef stew. Tell me more about your work, Violet said when they were alone. What is it like being a cowboy? Dalton considered the question. It is hard work. Long hours, sometimes dangerous, and the pay is not great, but there is something about it that gets into your blood. Being out on the open prairie, just you and the sky and the cattle, it is a kind of freedom you do not find in many places. Do you ever think about settling down, getting your own ranch? Sometimes, he admitted. I have been saving my wages for years now. I have enough to buy a small spread, maybe run a few hundred head of cattle. But it is a big step, going from working for someone else to being your own boss, and it is a lonely life, ranching alone. It does not have to be alone, Violet said carefully. No, Dalton agreed, his eyes locked on hers. It does not. Their food arrived, interrupting the moment, but the conversation flowed easily throughout the meal. They talked about books they had read, places they had been, dreams they harbored. Violet learned that Dalton could speak a fair amount of Spanish, picked up from vaqueros he had worked with over the years. He learned that she had always wanted to see the ocean but had never traveled farther east than Missouri. "Maybe someday we could go together," Dalton said. "California has ocean, and it is supposed to be beautiful. That would be quite the journey. The best things usually require a journey." After dinner, Dalton walked her home through the cold night air. Violet's breath formed clouds in front of her face, and she pulled her shawl tighter. Without a word, Dalton shrugged out of his coat and draped it around her shoulders. "You will freeze," she protested. "I am fine. Cowboys are used to the cold." She smiled, pulling his coat closer. It smelled like leather and wood smoke and something uniquely him. They walked slowly, neither wanting the evening to end. When they reached her house, Violet reluctantly returned his coat. They stood on her porch, the lamplight from inside casting warm shadows across Dalton's face. "Thank you for dinner," Violet said. "I had a wonderful time." "So did I." Dalton hesitated, then said, "Violet, I want to be honest with you about something. I am not a man who does things halfway. When I commit to something, I am all in. And I am finding myself very committed to the idea of you, of us." Violet's heart pounded. "That is quite direct." "Life is too short and too uncertain to dance around what matters. I learned that the hard way. So I am telling you now I am serious about courting you, about seeing where this goes. And if that scares you or if it is too much too fast, I need to know now." "It does not scare me," Violet said, stepping closer to him. "I am serious about this too, about you." "Good," Dalton said, and then he was cupping her face in his hands and kissing her gently. It was a careful kiss, respectful and sweet, but Violet felt it all the way to her toes. When they pulled apart, she was breathing hard, her cheeks flushed. "Oh," she said softly. "Oh," he agreed, grinning. "You should probably go before I invite you inside, and then the whole town would definitely have something to talk about." Dalton laughed, a warm sound that made her smile. "Fair enough. I will be back next week. Try not to miss me too much." "I make no promises." He kissed her once more, quick and light, then bounded down the porch steps and headed for his horse. Violet watched him go, her fingers pressed to her lips, still feeling the warmth of his kiss. Spring arrived slowly, as it always did in Nebraska. The snow melted, revealing the brown grass beneath, and gradually the prairie began to green. Dalton came to Wood River every week, sometimes staying for just an evening, sometimes for a whole weekend. They went on walks, attended church services together, and spent long hours talking about everything and nothing. Violet's sewing business continued to grow. She had become known as the best seamstress in the county, and women traveled from neighboring towns to commission work from her. She was making more money than she ever had, enough to not just survive but to actually save for the future. As the weeks turned into months, Violet found herself falling deeply in love with Dalton Xavier. It was different from what she had felt for Thomas. That had been a young love, built on shared dreams and plans for the future. What she felt for Dalton was more mature, more grounded. It was a love built on understanding and respect, on shared experiences of loss and survival, on the knowledge that life was hard but better when you had someone to face it with. One Sunday in late April, Dalton arrived with a picnic basket and suggested they ride out to a spot he had discovered by the creek. Violet agreed eagerly, and they rode out together on Dalton's horse, Violet sitting in front of him, feeling safe and warm in his arms. The spot was beautiful, a small grove of cottonwood trees by a bend in the creek where the water ran clear and fast. They spread a blanket on the grass and unpacked the food Dalton had bought from the hotel: cold chicken, fresh bread, cheese, and apple pie. They ate in comfortable silence, listening to the sound of the water and the birds singing in the trees. When they finished, Dalton lay back on the blanket, pulling Violet down beside him. She rested her head on his chest, listening to the steady beat of his heart. "I love you," Dalton said suddenly. "I have loved you for a while now, but I wanted to wait to tell you. I did not want to rush you or make you feel pressured, but I cannot keep it in any longer. I love you, Violet Sinclair, and I want to spend my life with you." Violet lifted her head to look at him, her eyes shining. "I love you too. I think I have loved you since that first day when you bought everything and told me to keep it. You gave me back my life, and then you gave me a reason to want to live it." Dalton sat up, taking both her hands in his. "Then marry me. I know it has not been a full year since Thomas passed, and if you want to wait longer for propriety's sake, I will wait. But I want you to know that I am asking. I want to marry you, Violet. I want to build a life with you. I bought a ranch, a small one about 5 miles from town. 200 acres with a house that needs some fixing up, but it has good grazing land and access to water. It could be ours, our home, our future." Violet felt tears streaming down her face, but they were happy tears. "Yes, yes, I will marry you. I do not care about propriety or what people think. I care about you, about us, about the life we can build together." Dalton pulled her into his arms and kissed her deeply, pouring all his love and hope and dreams into that kiss. When they finally broke apart, both were breathless and grinning. "When?" Dalton asked. "When can we get married?" "As soon as you want. Tomorrow, if we can arrange it." "Next week," Dalton decided. "That will give us time to do it properly. I want you to have a real wedding, not some rushed affair. You deserve that." "I just need you," Violet said. "Everything else is extra." They spent the rest of the afternoon making plans, talking about the future with an excitement neither had felt in a long time. They would get married in the church in Wood River, with whoever wanted to attend invited to come. Violet would wear her wedding dress, the one she had made herself all those years ago. They would move to Dalton's new ranch and work it together, combining her sewing income with his ranching to build something stable and lasting. The wedding took place on a bright Saturday morning in early May. The church was full, despite the short notice. It seemed everyone in Wood River wanted to see the widow marry the mysterious cowboy who had saved her. Violet wore her wedding dress, altered slightly to fit her better after the weight she had lost during her months of grief. Mrs. Patterson had insisted on decorating the church with wildflowers, and the result was simple but lovely. Dalton stood at the altar waiting for her, wearing a new suit that made him look almost unfamiliar. But when his eyes met hers and that familiar smile spread across his face, he was just Dalton again, the man she loved. The ceremony was brief but meaningful. When the preacher pronounced them husband and wife, Dalton kissed her with such tenderness that several women in the congregation sighed audibly. They walked out of the church together into the sunshine, hand in hand, ready to start their new life. The ranch Dalton had bought was modest but beautiful in its own way. The house was a simple 2-room structure that would need expanding, but it was sturdy and weathertight. The land rolled gently toward a creek that cut through the property, and there were already about 50 head of cattle grazing in the meadow. "It is perfect," Violet said, standing on the porch and surveying their domain. "It will be once we fix it up," Dalton said, coming up behind her and wrapping his arms around her waist. "I figure we can add on another room or two, maybe build a proper barn. And you can have a room for your sewing with good light and plenty of space." "We should build a nursery," Violet said quietly. Dalton stilled, then turned her around to face him. "Are you saying what I think you are saying?" "Not yet," Violet clarified, feeling her cheeks heat. "But I am saying that I hope to be saying it soon. I want children with you, Dalton. I want to fill this house with life and love and noise." "Nothing would make me happier," Dalton said, kissing her softly. "We will have a dozen children if you want them." "Let us start with one and see how we manage," Violet laughed. They threw themselves into the work of making the ranch successful. Dalton spent his days tending the cattle, mending fences, and slowly improving the property. Violet continued taking sewing commissions, and she also learned to help with the ranch work. She could ride now, having learned on Dalton's patient horse, and she helped with the feeding and basic care of the animals. Life was hard but good. They woke with the sun and fell into bed exhausted at the end of each day. But they were happy, genuinely happy, in a way that felt earned and real. They talked about everything, never letting problems fester or words go unsaid. They laughed together, worked together, and loved each other with a depth that grew stronger every day. Summer passed in a blur of work and heat and long, sweet evenings sitting on the porch together watching the sun set over the prairie. Fall brought cooler temperatures and preparations for winter. They butchered a steer, smoked and preserved the meat, and stored root vegetables in the cellar. Dalton bought another 50 head of cattle at auction, expanding their herd. In October, Violet realized she had missed her monthly courses. She waited another month to be sure, then told Dalton over dinner one evening. "I am pregnant," she said simply, watching his face carefully for his reaction. Dalton's fork clattered to his plate, and then he was out of his chair and lifting her up, spinning her around in a circle while whooping with joy. Violet laughed, holding onto his shoulders, giddy with his excitement. "We are having a baby," Dalton said, setting her down carefully as if she might break. "We are really having a baby, we really are," Violet confirmed. How are you feeling? Do you need to sit down? Should you be working so hard?" The questions tumbled out and Violet laughed at his sudden anxiety. "I am fine. I feel perfectly healthy, just a little tired in the mornings. The baby should come in late spring or early summer. And yes, I can still work. Pregnant women have been working since the dawn of time." Dalton pulled her into his arms, holding her close. "I am going to be a father," he said, wonder in his voice. "We are going to be parents." "We are," Violet agreed, feeling tears of joy prick her eyes. "We really are." They spent the winter preparing for the baby's arrival. Dalton built a cradle, carving it carefully from oak and sanding it until it was smooth as silk. Violet sewed tiny gowns and blankets, her hands moving automatically through the familiar motions while her mind wandered to the future. They expanded the house, adding a third room that would serve as a nursery, with windows that faced east to catch the morning light. In those quiet winter months, Violet sometimes thought about Thomas. She wondered what he would think of her life now, of the happiness she had found with Dalton. She liked to think he would approve. Thomas had been a good man who wanted the best for her, and Dalton was the best. He was everything she needed and more. Spring came again, and with it, new life. The prairie bloomed with wildflowers. The cattle had healthy calves, and Violet's belly grew round with their child. She felt wonderful, despite the discomfort of late pregnancy. Dalton was attentive and loving, bringing her anything she needed, rubbing her swollen feet at night and talking to her belly about all the things he would teach their child. On a warm June morning, Violet's labor began. Dalton rode to town to fetch the doctor and Mrs. Patterson, who had helped birth half the babies in the county. The labor was long and hard, and there were moments when Violet wondered if she had the strength to continue. But Dalton stayed by her side the entire time, holding her hand, wiping her forehead, telling her how strong she was and how much he loved her. Just after midnight, their son was born. He came into the world wailing, healthy and strong, with a shock of dark hair and his father's gray-blue eyes. "He is perfect," Dalton said, his voice thick with emotion as he held his son for the first time. "He is absolutely perfect. What should we name him?" Violet asked, exhausted but happy, watching her husband cradle their child with such tenderness. "I was thinking Daniel," Dalton said. "Daniel Thomas Xavier. Daniel for my father and Thomas for yours. What do you think?" Violet felt fresh tears stream down her face. "I think it is perfect. Hello, Daniel. Welcome to the world." The years that followed were full and rich. Little Daniel grew into a sturdy, curious toddler who followed his father around the ranch, mimicking everything Dalton did. When Daniel was 2, Violet gave birth to their daughter, a tiny thing with Violet's dark hair and delicate features. They named her Rose, for the wild roses that bloomed on the prairie every spring. The ranch prospered. Dalton had a gift for raising cattle, and their herd grew larger each year. Violet's sewing business remained steady, though she did less of it as the children grew, preferring to spend her time with them. They hired 2 ranch hands to help with the work, young men who bunked in the small building Dalton constructed for that purpose. When Daniel was 4 and Rose was 2, Violet found herself pregnant again. This time, twins arrived the following spring. 2 boys they named David and Matthew, who were identical in appearance but opposite in temperament. David was quiet and thoughtful, while Matthew was all energy and mischief. Their house expanded again to accommodate the growing family. They added a whole second floor with bedrooms for the children, and Violet finally got the kitchen she had always dreamed of, with a proper stove and plenty of counter space. The ranch now covered 400 acres, and their cattle herd numbered over 300 head. They had chickens and pigs, a large vegetable garden, and fruit trees Violet had planted that were finally beginning to bear. Life was not without its challenges. There were dry years when the grass did not grow well, and they worried about feeding the herd through winter. There were times when cattle got sick or predators took calves. There were the usual childhood illnesses that had Violet pacing the floor with worry until fevers broke and the children recovered. But through it all, Violet and Dalton faced everything together, their love a constant foundation beneath all of life's uncertainties. On their 10th wedding anniversary, Dalton took Violet back to the spot by the creek where he had proposed. The children stayed with Mrs. Patterson in town for the night, giving them a rare evening alone together. "You ever regret it?" Dalton asked as they sat on a blanket watching the sunset, just as they had all those years ago. "Marrying me, taking on this life," Violet looked at him in surprise. "Regret it, not for a single moment, do you?" "Never," Dalton said firmly. "But sometimes I wonder if you miss your old life, the one you had before. Before Thomas died, before everything changed." "That life is gone," Violet said gently. "And while I will always cherish the good parts of it, I cannot imagine wanting to go back. This life, the one we have built together, is everything I never knew I needed. You are everything I never knew I needed." "I love you," Dalton said, pulling her close. "I loved you that first day when I saw you standing in your yard trying so hard to be brave. I loved you when you accepted my help with dignity and grace. I loved you when you built a business from nothing and refused to give up. And I love you now, watching you mother our children and run our home and be the strongest person I know." "I love you too," Violet said, kissing him. "Thank you for riding into my life that winter day. Thank you for seeing me when I felt invisible. Thank you for giving me a second chance at happiness." "Thank you for taking it," Dalton replied. They made love under the stars that night, their bodies fitting together with the ease and familiarity of years of practice. Later, riding back to the ranch in the moonlight, Violet thought about how much her life had changed in 10 years. She had gone from a desperate widow selling everything she owned to a woman with a loving husband, 4 beautiful children, and a prosperous ranch. She had gone from barely surviving to truly thriving. The children grew. Daniel became a serious boy who loved learning and spent hours reading every book he could get his hands on. Rose was artistic, always drawing or sewing or creating something beautiful. The twins were inseparable, partners in adventure and occasional crime. Violet and Dalton talked sometimes about having more children, but 4 seemed like the right number. Their family felt complete. When Daniel turned 12, he started helping more seriously with the ranch work, learning everything Dalton could teach him about cattle and horses and the land. Rose at 10 was already an accomplished seamstress, having learned from her mother, and she talked about becoming a dressmaker when she grew up. The twins at 8 were still more interested in playing than working, but they had time to grow into their responsibilities. One evening in late summer, the whole family sat on the porch after dinner, watching the lightning bugs and listening to the crickets. Daniel was reading aloud from a book of poetry, his young voice growing more confident with each line. Rose was sketching the sunset, her pencil moving quickly across the paper. The twins were engaged in some complex game involving sticks and stones that made sense only to them. Violet sat in her rocking chair, Dalton beside her, their hands clasped between them. She looked at her children, at her husband, at the ranch spread out before them in the golden evening light, and felt such overwhelming gratitude that her eyes filled with tears. "What is it?" Dalton asked softly, noticing. "Nothing," Violet said, smiling through her tears. "Everything. Just feeling thankful for all of this. For you, for them, for the life we have built." Dalton squeezed her hand. "Me too, every single day." As the sun set and the stars began to appear, Violet thought back to that winter day 15 years ago when she had stood in her yard, selling everything she owned, certain her life was over. She had been so wrong. Her life had not been ending. It had been waiting to begin. The years continued to pass, marked by the changing seasons and the rhythms of ranch life. There were more challenges, of course. A bad drought one year that forced them to sell off part of their herd. A winter so harsh that they lost several cattle despite their best efforts. Rose broke her arm falling from a horse, and Matthew came down with pneumonia that had them all terrified for a week before he recovered. But there were far more joys than sorrows. Daniel won a scholarship to study agriculture at the state university, the first in their family to pursue higher education. Rose's artwork was displayed at the county fair, and she sold several pieces. The twins grew tall and strong, eventually losing their identical looks as their different personalities shaped their faces and bearing. David became interested in veterinary medicine, while Matthew discovered a talent for training horses. Violet and Dalton grew older together, their hair turning gray, their faces lining with age, but their love never diminished. If anything, it grew stronger, deepened by years of shared experiences and weathered storms. They were partners in the truest sense, neither complete without the other. On their 25th wedding anniversary, the children threw them a party. Daniel came home from university, bringing with him a young woman named Emily, whom he was clearly serious about. Rose organized the whole affair with her characteristic attention to detail. The twins handled the ranch work so Dalton could take the day off. Friends and neighbors from miles around came to celebrate. At the party, Mr. Patterson, now elderly but still spry, raised his glass in a toast. 25 years ago, I wondered about the cowboy who bought up all of Violet's belongings and told her to keep them. Seemed like a fool thing to do, if I am being honest. But looking at these two now, at the family they have built and the life they have made, I realized that Cowboy was the smartest man in Nebraska. Here is to Dalton and Violet Xavier, who proved that love and kindness can change everything. Everyone cheered and drank, and Violet blinked back tears. Dalton stood and pulled her to her feet, leading her in a dance to the music provided by a neighbor's fiddle. As they swayed together, surrounded by family and friends, Violet rested her head on her husband's chest and listened to his heartbeat, steady and strong. Happy. Dalton murmured into her hair. So happy, Violet confirmed. More than I ever thought possible. Life went on. Daniel married his Emily and brought her home to the ranch where they built a house on the western edge of the property. He took over more of the ranch management, allowing Dalton to slow down as age caught up with him. Emily fit seamlessly into the family, and within a year, she made Violet and Dalton grandparents with the birth of their grandson, Thomas Daniel Xavier. It felt right, completing a circle, honoring the past while embracing the future. Rose moved to Lincoln to pursue her art but came home often, bringing stories of the city and gifts for her nieces and nephews as they arrived. David went away to veterinary school but promised to return and set up a practice in Wood River. Matthew stayed on the ranch, working alongside his brother and father, eventually marrying a neighboring rancher's daughter and building their own small house near the creek. As Violet entered her 50s, she found herself surrounded by family in a way she had never imagined. 3 of her 4 children had given her grandchildren, with more on the way. The ranch was now a sprawling family enterprise, with multiple houses and families all working together. Sunday dinners at the main house required 3 tables pushed together to fit everyone, and the noise and chaos were beautiful. Dalton's hair had gone completely white, and he moved slower than he once did, but his eyes were still that same striking gray-blue, and his smile still made Violet's heart skip. They spent their evenings on the porch, watching the sun set over land that belonged to them and their children, talking about their day or sitting in comfortable silence. "You remember that first winter?" Violet asked one evening. "When you rode up to my yard while I was selling everything?" "I remember," Dalton said. "I remember thinking you were the bravest woman I had ever seen, standing there with your chin up even though your world was falling apart. I remember thinking you were either crazy or an angel," Violet said with a laugh. "No sane man would have done what you did." "Maybe I was a little crazy," Dalton admitted, "but I knew from the moment I saw you that you were someone special, someone worth taking a risk for." "That was quite the risk. $500 was a fortune." "Best money I ever spent," Dalton said firmly. "It bought me you and everything that came after. I would pay it 1,000 times over." Violet reached for his hand, their fingers intertwining with practiced ease. "We have built something good here, Haven, not we. We have built something great," Dalton corrected. "Something that will last long after we are gone." They sat in silence, watching their grandson, little Thomas, who would turn 5 next month, chase fireflies in the yard while his mother watched from the porch of the nearby house. The cattle lowed in the distance, a dog barked, somewhere a baby cried and was quickly soothed. These were the sounds of life, of family, of home. "No regrets?" Dalton asked, repeating the question he had asked years before. "Not a single one," Violet replied. "This life with you has been everything, more than everything." "I love you," Dalton said. "I will love you until my last breath and beyond." "And I love you," Violet said, "always and forever." As the stars came out and the fireflies danced their ancient dance, Violet Sinclair Xavier thought about the journey that had brought her here. From the depths of grief and desperation to the heights of love and fulfillment. From a widow selling everything in winter to a matriarch presiding over a thriving ranch and a large, loving family. The years continued their inevitable march. Violet and Dalton celebrated their 30th anniversary, then their 40th. Their children were now middle-aged, their grandchildren growing into teenagers and young adults. Great-grandchildren began to arrive, tiny new lives adding their voices to the family chorus. Dalton's health began to fail in his early 70s. Nothing dramatic at first, just a gradual slowing, a persistent cough, a tiredness that no amount of rest could cure. The doctor said his heart was wearing out, that years of hard work had taken their toll. There was nothing to be done except make him comfortable. Violet refused to accept it at first. She had already lost one husband. She could not lose another. But as the months passed and Dalton grew weaker, she had to face the inevitable truth. This was not something love or determination could fix. One evening in late summer, with the windows open to catch the breeze, Dalton called all the children and grandchildren to the house. They came, all of them, filling the house with their presence. Dalton sat in his favorite chair, looking small and frail in a way that broke Violet's heart. "I want to say goodbye," he said simply, "while I still can, while I am still myself." There were protests, tears, denials, but Dalton raised his hand for silence. "I have lived a good life, a great life. I have loved and been loved. I have worked hard and built something lasting. I have children and grandchildren who will carry on after me. What more could any man ask for?" He looked at each of them in turn. "Take care of each other. Take care of your mother. And remember that love is what matters. Everything else is just details." One by one, they came to him. They hugged him, kissed him, told him they loved him. When the last had left, only Violet remained, sitting beside his chair, holding his hand. "You saved my life," Violet said quietly. "That winter day, you saved my life in every way a person can be saved." "You saved mine too," Dalton replied. "I was just going through the motions before I met you. You gave me purpose. You gave me a reason to build something instead of just drifting from job to job." "I love you so much," Violet said, her voice breaking. "I do not know how to say goodbye." "Then do not," Dalton said. "This is not goodbye. This is just I will see you later. When your time comes, I will be waiting, and then we will have forever." Dalton Xavier passed away 3 days later, peacefully in his sleep, with Violet lying beside him. She woke at dawn to find him gone, his face peaceful, his hand still in hers. The grief was crushing, but different from when Thomas died. She had been young then, unprepared for loss. Now she was older, and while the pain was no less sharp, she knew she would survive it. She had to, for her children and grandchildren. For the legacy she and Dalton had built together. The funeral was enormous, the church packed with friends, neighbors, ranch hands past and present, and the large extended family. Daniel gave the eulogy, speaking of his father's kindness, his work ethic, his unwavering love for his wife and family. Violet sat in the front pew, surrounded by her children, and felt the weight of loss settling over her like a heavy blanket. They buried Dalton on a hill overlooking the ranch, in a spot he had once said had the best view in Nebraska. Violet stood by his grave long after everyone else had left, talking to him about the children, about her day, about how much she missed him. "I will see you later," she whispered finally, echoing his words. "Wait for me." The months after Dalton's death were hard. The house felt too quiet without him. The bed was too big. Every sunset reminded her of the evenings they had spent on the porch together. But Violet persevered, leaning on her children, finding solace in her grandchildren's laughter, and staying busy with the work that always needed doing on a ranch. She lived another 7 years, watching her great-grandchildren grow, seeing the ranch continue to prosper under Daniel and Matthew's management. Rose returned home when her arthritis made city life difficult, moving into the main house with her mother. They spent their days sewing and painting and talking. Two women who had lived full lives and had no regrets. On a warm June evening, just after her 80th birthday, Violet sat on the porch in her rocking chair, watching the sunset. Rose was inside making dinner, and the sounds of family voices drifted from the various houses scattered across the property. Everything was peaceful, perfect, exactly as it should be. Violet felt a deep tiredness settle over her, but it was not unpleasant. She closed her eyes, still rocking gently, and she could swear she felt a familiar hand take hers. "Dalton," she whispered, in her mind, or perhaps in truth she heard his voice. "I told you I would wait. Are you ready?" "Yes," Violet said. "I am ready." Rose found her mother an hour later, still sitting in her rocking chair, a peaceful smile on her face. She had passed quietly into whatever came next, her long and eventful life complete. They buried Violet beside Dalton on the hill, and the entire town of Wood River turned out to pay their respects to the woman who had been a widow at 24, a bride at 25, and a pillar of the community for the rest of her long life. Years later, their great-great-grandchildren would play on the ranch that Violet and Dalton had built, running through fields and splashing in the creek. The main house, expanded and modernized but still fundamentally the same structure, remained the heart of the family compound. And on quiet evenings when the wind blew just right, some said you could still sense their presence. Two souls who had found each other in the hardest of times and built something beautiful that lasted long beyond their years. The story of the widow who was selling everything in winter and the cowboy who bought it all and told her to keep it became family legend, passed down through generations. It was a story about kindness and love, about taking chances and building futures, about how a single act of generosity could change everything. And high on the hill overlooking the ranch, two headstones stood side by side, weathered by time but still legible: Dalton Xavier, 1848–1919, beloved husband, father, and friend Violet Sinclair Xavier, 1852–1927, beloved wife, mother, and heart of our home together forever the end.